to introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Joanne.
Thanks, Linda. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Vibert. Elizabeth, Janet, I'm not showing up on the screen. Is that right? I'm okay?
Yeah, you're fine. I see you.
Okay, good. Elizabeth is a social historian whose research focuses on gender, poverty, colonialism, and food systems. Originally from Nova Scotia, she completed a BA in political science, an MA in international development studies, culminating in a doctorate in modern history at the University of Oxford. She's been teaching at the University of Victoria since 1994. Her main research interests are food insecurity and food sovereignty, particularly in colonized spaces and in the era of climate crisis, and the intersecting histories of poverty, gender, and race. She is director of the research project 4 Stories About Food Sovereignty, Transnational Crises, and Local Action, which draws together food producers and researchers from 4 continents to examine historical and contemporary food crises and community responses in an era of climate crisis. As many of you may know, she co-produced and wrote the award-winning documentary film, The Thinking Garden, and has also written or edited 3 books and numerous articles on colonial history, indigenous settler relations, and South African history. Elizabeth's other major research focus is the study of the experience of rural poverty for generations of women in South Africa during and after apartheid. She is collaborating with community members to collect the life histories of older women in communities in Limpopo province, examining intergenerational politics and the quest for food sovereignty, particularly for women. The people whose lives she documents in her research are so much more than research subjects. Elizabeth shows great respect for who they are and the work they do. They become friends as she studies their lives and livelihood in their home surroundings, and then honored guests in her home when they travel to Canada. Elizabeth is community-minded, kind, gracious, and inclusive, a person who builds networks all over the world. Today, we have an opportunity to learn from a person who is deeply interested in and knowledgeable about food insecurity and food sovereignty, particularly with regard to the impact of the climate crisis on women. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was a really lovely and slightly overwhelming introduction. And thank you, Linda, also for your introduction, which anticipated just perfectly a number of things that I'll talk about. People will think that you and I teed things up in advance, which we did not. It's really a pleasure to be speaking to GRAN, which is an organization that I've had a very fond relationship with for some years, to the point that the very first audience for our film, The Thinking Garden, was Victoria GRAN in late 2016, a few months before we even formally launched the film. In fact, I'm not sure that at the GRAN screening we had even the final cut yet. I think that you watched the version, I think that the GRAN members here watched the version without music. So yes, my relationship with GRAN and Victoria is a long one and a very fond one. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to GRAN across the country. And I have also spoken to GRAN and Stephen Lewis Foundation Grandmothers Campaign members in other places like Halifax and Toronto in the past. So perhaps I may have met some of you. In fact, I know I've met a couple of you at least on those occasions. I'm going to share my screen, which is much more inspiring to look at if you have the thumbnails of the various people, myself included, you can move it. You can click on that thumbnail and move it off to the side so that it's out of the way of the images if you would like to do so. So Joanne asked me to speak about a few things, in particular, the impacts of the climate crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, and then zooming into Southern Africa and South Africa, where I do my research. She also asked me to talk about food security and food sovereignty and the relationship between those concepts and the distinctions in those concepts. And so what I'm going to do is start with some very broad context. It's sort of resonating with some of what Linda said in the beginning, some very broad context about the impacts of the climate crisis in sub-Saharan and Southern Africa. So starting with the bad news then. And then I'll turn to the place that I know best, the villages of Nwamitwa in Limpopo province in South Africa, and the efforts by women farmers there, like Flora Mashele, whom you see in this image, to develop deeper food security for their communities, and indeed to move toward a measure of food sovereignty, where they control and dictate the nature of their own food systems. I'd like to make a very brief territorial acknowledgement. I and the Victoria GRAN members are on the territories of the Wasanich and Esquimalt and Songhees peoples of the Southern Vancouver Island. And these unceded territories are a beautiful region of lands and waters where we are privileged to make our livelihoods and live with our families. And of course, these Indigenous peoples' relationships remain very profound on these lands and waters into the present day. And the image that's shared here shows Chief Gordon Planis at the center of the photo, who's one of our research collaborators, community-based research collaborators in the 4 Stories About Food Sovereignty project. And in this image, he's pictured with participants from 3 of the other contexts, or the 3 other contexts that we study most closely in 4 Stories. On the left and right, Wayuu Indigenous people from Colombia, 2 of our wonderful African grandmothers, my dear friends, Josephine and Mpepu from South Africa. And to Chief Planis's left is Fatima Obedat from Jordan, one of the Palestinian participants in our project. So I'm not going to talk very much about the 4 Stories project in the main remarks today, but I'm very happy to answer questions about it and to talk about those other contexts in the question period. Before I say anything else, I have to acknowledge and introduce my completely indispensable research collaborator, Basani Ngobeni, without whom none of this research would be possible. She's pictured here with Christine Welsh, the director of our wonderful film, The Thinking Garden, fantastic Canadian Indigenous filmmaker who I was so privileged and honored to work with on The Thinking Garden. And she was the director, and Basani became so indispensable within a week of us arriving in South Africa that she served as the assistant director, sorry. And Basani has been right next to me the whole time we've been doing the oral history research, beginning in 2012 in Limpopo province, in the village of Jopi, where the women's farm is situated, but in the other villages of the Nwamitwa traditional territory. And her, rootedness in the place, her knowledge of 5 South African languages, her very close relationships with the women in the village. She didn't actually know the women of Jopi before we started, but of course she's related to some of them, and they knew each other's grandmothers and grandchildren and so on. And her rootedness in the place, her deep respect for the enormous contributions of those farmers, and her just general wisdom, despite the fact that she has only just now turned 30, have been really indispensable to my research, to our research. So now moving on to the bad news that I said I would start with. The World Bank announced during the COVID crisis that perhaps 150 million more people would fall into extreme poverty and malnutrition as a result of the COVID crisis in 2020. By the end of 2021, they suggested perhaps 150 million additional people would fall into abject poverty. And the World Bank's benchmark for extreme poverty is earning less than or living on less than $1.90 US a day. And many of the people that I'll be talking about in the villages of South Africa live on less than $1.90 a day. So they fall into that category of the so-called poorest of the poor. The World Bank had been anticipating some fall in the rate of extreme poverty by 2021, 2022. And has been marking year by year a fall in the number of people living in extreme poverty up until about 2015. And Linda made reference to this in her introduction. Around 2015, 2016, a whole series of crises came together, principally crisis driven by climate, which resulted in a reverse and a decline in previous improvements in levels of poverty and levels of malnutrition globally. So malnutrition rates that had been falling across more than a decade, even part of two decades earlier in the century, those rates began to rise again come 2015. And so really, given this shift to growing levels of malnutrition globally and increasing levels of extreme poverty globally in the last 5 years, there's really no chance of meeting those sustainable development goals by 2030, as the original ambitious plan was aiming for. Goal number 1, an end to extreme poverty by 2030. Goal number 2, zero hunger by 2030. I think it's safe to say in 2021, with a resumption of increasing rates of malnutrition and extreme poverty, that there's very little likelihood of meeting those ambitious and important goals. And COVID, of course, the global pandemic, is exacerbating the picture, is making matters worse, is exacerbating already existing extreme inequities, both within countries and across countries. But the climate crisis is a massive factor in these declines and reversals in improvements that had previously been underway. Last week in Washington, President Biden hosted a global climate summit where world leaders announced a series of bold new targets to reduce emissions very substantially this decade. The US promised to halve its carbon emissions this decade. The UK went even further. Canada, slightly less ambitious, but nevertheless significant pledges to reduce our carbon emissions this decade. And all of this will be crucial, and the action in the next few years will be absolutely crucial to ensure that we stay within a livable limit of global heating. At the summit in Washington last week, Biden called on other governments to contribute to the Climate Finance Fund that Linda mentioned, a UN funding mechanism to assist poor countries, resource poor countries, to deal with the crises of climate change that they are living more profoundly than anyone else, and to which they have contributed so little. Africa, for instance, contributes well less than 5% of total global emissions. Yet in the past decade, the countries of sub-Saharan Africa have been collectively suffering annual costs of climate related to climate crisis, things like droughts and floods and cyclones and so on, at a cost of about $700 million a year across the sub-Saharan African region. And that's sort of averaged, annualized, but year by year. And for instance, Mozambique suffered 2 catastrophic cyclones and flooding in 2019 and has had 3 more or 4 more since then. The 2 in 2019 alone cost $3.2 billion, caused $3.2 billion in damage. That's money that Mozambique has to look for in global financial markets from global lenders like the World Bank and so on. And that's funding that should be available in the climate finance structure, which, as Linda said, Canada hasn't made its pledge to just yet for this year. So without finance to meet the costs of catastrophes that they did not create, poor countries, resource poor countries will face a very bleak future, some of the details of which I will speak to in my Southern African case study. And this is a graph. You've heard that, you know, we need to take steps immediately, take steps in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. You hear it framed in different ways. But this graph really hit me between the eyes, I would say, showing our growing CO2 emissions since 1960. And this is just CO2. This isn't including the other greenhouse gases. Since 1960, there we are approaching the ceiling beyond which we will not keep global heating to 1.5 degrees centigrade on average, and likely not to 2 degrees. So we are really approaching that sort of 11th hour precipitously quickly. And now zooming into Southern Africa, as is the case in much of the global South, this region is much harder hit than average by the climate crisis. So for instance, a recent study by some climate modelers in South Africa points out that average maximum temperatures may rise by 6 degrees. We're talking about 1.5 to 2 degrees. In Southern Africa, average maximum temperatures may rise by 6 degrees within the next 50 years. That's cataclysmic. The women at the farm that I'll be talking about shortly are already telling me about all the impacts of perhaps 2 degrees average warming currently. It's hard to even countenance what the impacts of 6 degrees will look like. The Oxfam's Southern African regional director speaks to some of those impacts. We're witnessing millions of already poor people facing extreme food insecurity, exhausting their reserves because of compounding climate shocks that hit already vulnerable communities the hardest. Speaking to a different region of Africa, from the Horn of Africa, the regional director of Oxfam says, we're in a vicious cycle where poor and marginalized communities, in particular women and girls, are more exposed to the climate crisis and yet least able to cope and recover from its harm. So, and this is the vicious cycle on a global scale as well, where poor countries are most exposed to the crisis and least able to cope and recover from its harm. And within those countries, women and girls in that position. So now I am going to speak about a more uplifting story, the story of women taking charge in particular contexts, taking charge, seeking a measure of food sovereignty at home. And before I do that, I'll give you a little bit of an insight into what food sovereignty means in distinction to food security, although the concepts really function on a spectrum. But I would like to just draw out that distinction for you as I was asked to do. So food sovereignty is the right of, sorry, I'm going to move my image out of the way of the text here. The right of peoples to healthy, no, I've gone ahead. The right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound, and I would say socially sound as well, and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. So perhaps a community or the people of a region wish to define an agriculture system based on import of foodstuffs. That's their decision to make. But many communities around the world find themselves in the position of having very little choice but to accept cheap imported food flowing into their countries and displacing their local farmers. And they haven't been given any kind of control over those decisions. So food sovereignty is partly about local communities having the power to define their own food systems. It's crucially about that. And this alarming quotation from a US Secretary of Agriculture under the Reagan government in the 1980s speaks to the sort of counter view, a counter view which sometimes is articulated within a concept of or within a framework of food security, where food security can share many of the political perspectives of the food sovereignty outlook. But a sort of cramped view or more conservative view of food security evacuates the politics from the framework, from consideration, tends to focus on maximizing production, tends to focus on questions of yield and caloric intake, without consideration of what kind of food people are eating. Is it culturally appropriate food? Is it locally produced food? Is it sustainably produced food? Is it produced in socially just ways that doesn't trounce the rights of the workers producing the food, and so on. So food security is frequently evacuated of those kinds of political issues, as we see in this pronouncement by the US Secretary of Agriculture in the 1980s. He says, the idea that developing countries should feed themselves is an anachronism from a bygone era. They should be buying cheap and efficiently produced American produce. Which obviously had all sorts of benefits for the American economy and the American farmer, but very few benefits for the farmers of the global South. And we did see in the 1980s and 90s and even into the early 2000s and in the global trade frameworks that persist into the present day, we see resonance of this view that the more efficient economies should produce the food and the less efficient producers should simply be put out of business, replaced by large commercial farms and foreign-owned farms and multinational agribusiness and so on, who will produce their food for them much more cheaply and efficiently. Historians talk about three global food regimes. I've studied the colonial food regime for much of my career, or aspects of it. Then we talk about the post-war food regime of the 50s, 60s, 70s. That was the era of the Green Revolution and so on. We inhabit today the corporate food regime, the third of these food regimes, which has really been the predominant, really overwhelming food regime, determining the nature of the global food system and its regional iterations since the 1980s. So this global food system emerged in the wake of worldwide economic shocks in the 1970s, in the midst of the brutal structural adjustment programs that the World Bank and the international financial institutions imposed on developing economies in the 1980s and 90s. And some aspects of those structural adjustment programs bore some fruit, had some positive benefits, but certainly not for agriculture. Those structural adjustment programs that were externally imposed on the global South in the 80s, 90s, into the early 2000s, slashed government support for agriculture, pushed many small-scale farmers out of production in those regions. In Canada and the global North, this era saw the consolidation of the shift to massive commercial farms, also pushing many family-level farmers off their farms and out of production. And it's no coincidence that in the 1980s, at the time of this sort of shift and consolidation of global emerging corporate agricultural structures and the consolidation of their power, it's no coincidence that at that very moment, the food sovereignty movement was born. Local and regional and national level peasant organizations and family farmer organizations began to work together to create solidarities of small scale farmers, family farmers, farm workers, indigenous peoples. These movements first grew up and took on significant size in South America and then spread globally until in 1993, many of these groups came together to form the organization La Via Campesina, the Peasant Way, which sounds like a South American organization, but indeed is a very powerful global organization in the present day. And this solidarity movement, La Via Campesina, which is an umbrella under which many smaller regional farmer organizations operate, and of course there are others outside the umbrella as well. This solidarity movement among food producers and food workers was a direct response to the pressures of the growing corporate agricultural model, a model that emphasized industrial and capital intensive and corporate dominated and a neoliberal model of agriculture. The kinds of inequities and injustices that were spawned by that and have been spawned by that system include widespread dispossession of small-scale farmers' lands and family farms. Those inequities include the fact that, well, up to 70% of the food consumed around the globe is grown by small-scale producers and family-level producers, the largest number of them women. Nevertheless, the enormous profits of the global food production system accrue to corporate owners, to corporations, and an increasingly smaller and smaller number of those agri-food corporations who control even the very seed on which farmers depend for their livelihoods. In 2007, the global spread of La Via Campesina and this global peasant movement became clear when more than 500 organizations from around representatives of organizations from around the world from some 80 countries came together in Mali for the Nyeleti conference. Nyeleti is my name in Chitsonga, for the Nyeleni conference, where they committed to the principles of food sovereignty. And a number of those principles are highlighted here in these bullet points. So food sovereignty foregrounds the aspirations and the needs and the interests of those who produce the food and those who distribute and consume food. It empowers peasant and family farmer agriculture, artisanal fishers, and so on. It defends the interests of the next generation in a very explicit way and a very deliberate way. It prioritizes local and regional over national and global markets. It prioritizes ecological and social and economic sustainability and justice. It promotes transparent trade where the farmers know the incomes that are being generated by the food they produce. It ensures rights to use and manage the lands, the air, the water, the seeds that are essential to food production. It ensures that the rights to those things are in the hands of the producers and not in the hands of 5 or 6 multinational corporations that control seed and the chemicals required to grow those seeds. And it implies social relations that should be free of oppression and inequality. So those are the principles of food sovereignty. And you can see a distinction between at least a narrow vision of food security and a more robust and political vision of food sovereignty. And I'm happy to answer questions about that sort of spectrum afterwards. And now to the place dearest to my heart, Southern Africa, a place that many of you know very well, I'm sure. Here you see on the map on the left, Nwamitwa, the traditional territory of under Chief Nwamitwa, where the village of Jopi, where I do a lot of my research, is found. Here's one of the farmers at Hlikitani Community Gardens. Some of you have seen the film, I know, and some of you have even seen it multiple times. So you may recognize Dinah McLaughlin, who speaks a lot in the film about why the farm is a women's farm and how keeping men at bay in order to preserve women's autonomy and women's decision-making power was viewed as important. Now, Southern Africa suffered, the whole region of Southern Africa began to suffer a severe drought, what was called an epic drought at the time, which really closed in 2015. And 2015-16 were the worst years of that regional drought, especially in South Africa. And you heard about zero water day approaching in Cape Town. You probably heard about the threats to big commercial farmers at the time. But really that drought continued across several years and only came to an end last year. But drought it's long been an ongoing threat in this region, but instances of drought, episodes of drought are becoming much more frequent, and they are much longer lasting than they were in the past. Here are two slightly different vantages on the Nwanedzi River as it looked in 2012 when I was there, as it looked in 2015. This image really speaks to the desperate nature of the drought that we're talking about from 2015 onward. This map shows, again, in quite graphic form, the impacts of the drought in 2015-16 regionally. It shows in the very region that I'll be talking about, the asterisk in northeastern South Africa, you can see Nwamitwa fell into an area of extreme drought where less than 35% of normal rainfall, loss of more than 65% of normal rainfall. But you can see also in the blue, at the same time that some regions of Southern Africa were suffering from drought, other regions like Tanzania were facing floods. This is the story of climate crisis. This map really speaks to that. Locally on the ground, what that meant, what the drought meant, was that household farmers who rely on the rains in the winter couldn't grow any maize whatsoever. So local entrepreneurs became busy buying up all the maize they could find, but countrywide, nationwide maize production was seriously impacted in 2015-16. So there was a shortage even of the commercially processed and packaged maize. And the impacts of drought are wide-ranging. The impacts, of course, of repeated and extremely drought of extreme duration are even more catastrophic. Drought has impacts on crop production, needless to say, on livestock production, because livestock wither and die just as do the crops. And livestock, as you're probably aware, are a key sort of bank for wealth for small-scale farmers and pastoralists in Southern Africa. Drought has disastrous effects for soil health, for human health, for prices of food. The previous example of local entrepreneurs buying up commercially available maize, the prices of which had increased by up to 20% that year. So staple food prices, even the prices of the most basic food basket, increase dramatically during drought. Water availability, of course, is the very definition of drought, reduced water availability. So you saw the river, but what we don't see images of is what's happening to groundwater reserves during periods of prolonged drought. Much of Southern Africa, indeed much of the continent of Africa, has quite rich groundwater reserves, but repeated periods of lengthy drought will be drawing down those groundwater reserves. And for women in particular in these communities, the shortage of water has endless ramifications beyond food production. Here's an image from 2015 of women just down the road from Mpepu Mitsenga's house, for those of you who know Mpepu, one of the farmers at the farm that I'll be talking about. Women just down the road from Mpepu's house gathering in the morning to collect water for their household use. In the village of Jopi for some years now, the districts of the village have access to the public standpipe 2 days a week. So these are women who are lined up at the standpipe, one of their 2 days a week, to fill every plastic container they own with water for bathing, for cooking, for all the other household uses. Most of the houses in the village, most of the households in the village can't afford to connect to the municipal water supply. And even if they could, in a context of deepening drought, repeated deepening drought, and municipal mismanagement of the public water supply and water systems, even if people could afford to connect to the municipal supply, they wouldn't be getting a very reliable supply of water. So the Mitsengas, and Mpepu Mitsenga's household has a groundwater well, which, as long as the groundwater supplies are sufficient, produces well for their household. But they're among the few households that can afford a well on their own property. So most people, like these women, resort to lining up at the municipal standpipe and collecting water when they're permitted. Now to the farm. This is Rosina Masengu, one of the farmers at Likatani Community Garden in Jopi Village. She's referring here to the impacts of cataclysmic drought, but in combination with a very ill-timed major theft of the irrigation infrastructure from Likatani Garden. And that episode is spoken to in the film, so I won't go into it. But I brought students from UVic on a field school to South Africa a few years ago. And when we visited the farm, the students had seen these wonderful photos of this very productive women's farm. And then we arrived and it was hit by the emerging drought and the fact that they had had their irrigation infrastructure stripped a few months before, and the students were so depressed to see the farm not in the state that they had seen in photos. And they asked Rosina, well, what are you going to do? And she said, well, we had to start again. We started again. And that's sort of very matter of fact response. What could we do? We don't have the luxury of wringing our hands. We had to start again. We had to get together and start again. And that's what the farmers did. I just find that such a powerful response. And here are the women reinstalling their drip irrigation in 2015-16, partly funded by the funds raised by the UVic students who visited. Now, when I talk about the farm's contributions to the women who are farmers themselves, but also to their broader community, I speak in terms of contributions to community building and community sustenance, to poverty reduction and health of the community, to women's autonomy. But here I'm going to speak specifically to the farm's contributions in the era of deepening climate crisis. Speaking just briefly to health, Mijaji Ndlovu says, before the farm, so before they founded the farm, which is almost 30 years ago now in 1992, before the farm, each and everyone was the victim of kwashi. Kwashi being from the term kwashiorkor, being the local phrase that's used to describe all different forms of malnutrition. So before the farm was founded in 1992, each and every one was the victim of kwashi. 1991-92 was another drastic, epic drought in the region. I love Alice Hamedi's phrase, with the vegetables, now that we're growing the vegetables at the farm, the children are fresh. It's a wonderful description of the impact on children's health. So now to look at a number of ways in which the farm has adapted to climate crisis. The farm and the farmers adapting on the ground to the lived experience of climate crisis. First of all, this image shows the water conserving drip irrigation, which they installed in the 2010s And here is Dinah Beloy hand watering the nursery plants, the plants that they grow in their own sort of little micro nursery here and then plant out into the field. So water conserving drip irrigation, which you don't see in the film because we filmed right after the theft. But water conserving drip irrigation has been a crucial innovation at the farm to adapt to the climate crisis. Part of the water system is the water storage tank. Now you may look at this and think, oh, perfect. It collects rainwater and stores water in the rainy season, which is true. But of course, it's not in the rainy season that they need that water. It's in the dry season, which is about 3/4 of the year. And then the supply in the cistern draws down. But what they actually do with this cistern throughout much of the year is they pump water in the morning, fill it up, and then draw the water from there rather than directly from the wells throughout the day and the week. The women had this photo taken at the end of 2019 when a young American farmer was on their farm with them for about 2 months doing a sort of internship with the farmers. And she helped them to begin to regenerate their soil in a really profound way through such practices as mulching and composting. And they had Heather, the American farmer, they had her take this photo and said, send it to Lizzie. Lizzie needs to see this. So they knew that I was going to want to see them returning to practices that they will have done as children, that their mothers and grandmothers will have followed, but that in a way were educated out of them by the agricultural extension officers and workers who use much more conventional methods involving pesticides and chemicals and so on, rather than these regenerative methods that the women are gradually returning to. Composting also, composting all the waste that they collect around the farm to put it back into use to build the soil on the farm. Crop choice has been a really important innovation in the face of climate crisis. The village, the people of Southern Africa broadly, but certainly the people of rural South Africa are very keen on cabbage. And cabbage is very pest intensive. For those of you who grow gardens, you'll be familiar with that challenge of the cabbage family. As the women once told me, cabbage calls the pests to the garden. And so they decided, after one too many years of cabbage creating problems not just for the cabbage crop, but for the neighboring crops, they decided to switch to what they call spinach, miroho. In fact, 3 types of large leafy greens. They grow mustard greens, which you see in this image here. They grow giant spinach, and they grow Swiss chard. And they taught the village, essentially. They taught the people of the village to appreciate those greens in preference to cabbage, and they no longer grow cabbage. Here's an image of the women preparing to grind their maize for maize meal, but also saving maize seed. And they have a seed librarian. One of the retired farmers keeps the seed library. And it's full of, in Coke bottles and other containers, it's full of seed that they've saved over the years and even across the generations. Some of their mother's seed is in the library as well. They save, in particular, the maize seed, for instance, that has fared the best in low rainfall years. So this is local knowledge, local indigenous knowledge harnessed to respond to the climate crisis. Here's an image of Mamaro Peng in the tomato house, where they grow the tomatoes under the cover of this landscaping cloth to reduce the heat, which is pretty extreme. When I visit, usually it's in their fall, our spring. Temperatures are frequently in the 30s every day. But when I was last there in their early summer of 2019, just before the pandemic made it impossible to travel, the temperatures were in the low 40s every day. And tomatoes get a black, burned skin in those conditions. So this landscaping cloth in the tomato house is a crucial adaptation to mitigate the heat. And here's a field that may be familiar to you from the film. We filmed this very field in 2015 when we were filming The Thinking Garden. Drought-stricken maize, no maize production that year, but look what's all over the ground. This is the indigenous plants of the region flourishing in a context of severe drought. Indigenous plants including things like mallow and gouche, I'm not sure what the English word for gouche is, and various amaranth plants. And these and we also see cowpeas, one of the legumes that they grow. These flourish in the worst drought conditions. So these are plants that can be harnessed for their nutritional content at times like this. I mentioned that many parts of Africa have actually very productive groundwater aquifers. Southern Africa less so, but nevertheless, there are regional zones where there are very productive groundwater aquifers, but only something like 5% of agriculture in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is irrigated. 95% of African agriculture is reliant on seasonal rains. So the potential to develop that irrigation and groundwater potential, and to do so in a sustainable way, the sustainable way that small scale farming would tend to do, is pretty significant. I'm going to go ahead to this slide, so I've been talking about farming at this community farm with its irrigation infrastructure, with its resources that have come in as a result of some external fundraising. The Finnish government was supporting this farm for a time after they won a national farming prize. So they've had resources made available to them that many small scale farmers don't. And it's a 15-acre farm. It's not all that small, in fact, with some 27 farmers working there. But most global south farming and most southern African farming is household cultivation, which is rain-fed and rain-reliant. So this is a corner of Mpepu Mutsenga's home garden. She, in fact, does water from her well when necessary, but even those who have a well and who have irrigation access prefer to rely on the rains when growing their home gardens. And so those are the gardens that absolutely fail in these years of drought or years of flood. And those are the vast majority of small-scale farmers in Southern Africa. So to finish up, I'll just make a few sort of overarching comments about the sorts of changes we need, the sorts of supports that are needed, and the sorts of changes that are needed going forward. Obviously, really ambitious climate action is needed across many sectors, all sectors of our economy. I'll speak to the agricultural ones. We really need to see the scaling up of sustainable and regenerative food systems that, rather than destroying the very essential elements on which they rely, like soil and water and air, that instead of destroying those very essential elements, nurture them and regenerate them and improve them and help them to flourish. In the process of scaling up and supporting those systems, we need to keep in mind very clearly the specific needs for support of women who, up to now, in many parts of the global south, have been frozen out of a lot of the capital that's needed to farm, even access to improved seed or to various kinds of inputs like compost. Women tend not to have the capital that makes available those sorts of sustainable inputs. And women have much more trouble getting bank loans. Women have much more trouble getting access to farm labor and so on. So specific targeted support to make it possible for women to take part in the scaling up of these systems is crucial. We need to be thinking about regenerating not just the soil, although crucially the soil, but also peatlands and wetlands and forests, which are sinks for carbon rather than producers of emissions, sinks for carbon emissions. Ideally, we need to reduce quickly the land that's used for animals and feed for animals, and think about food, land that produces food for humans, and invest in the kind of resilient water infrastructure that I was just depicting at the farm. Often people will say, yes, well, that kind of small scale farming isn't going to feed the 9 or 10 billion people that will be on the planet by 2050. There's actually quite a lot of evidence to suggest that this kind of intensive, sustainable, regenerative farming can indeed feed the planet with a growing population. As Olivier de Schutter said, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food said 10 years ago, scientific evidence demonstrates that agroecological methods may outperform chemical fertilizer-based methods in boosting food production, especially in the vulnerable environments where people who are going hungry live, especially in those environments most vulnerable to climate crisis. Agroecological and regenerative methods have been shown to outproduce the chemically based methods. So here is Mpepu speaking with her husband Daniel, who recently passed away. Mpepu Mitsenga speaking to what's needed by the farmers of the Global South. She says, we need the ways of our mothers and grandmothers. And perhaps those ways of the mothers and grandmothers infused with the research knowledge that's growing. Still, there's much less research done on agroecological farming methods than on conventional farming methods. Most of the research and development money on farming goes to conventional farming methods, conventional of the last 50 years. But increasing amounts of funding are going into agroecological methods in the face of the climate crisis. So those methods of the mothers and grandmothers, informed by some of the best recent research into regenerative methods, would be a pretty great marriage in my view. Building resilience in the face of increasingly frequent climate-related crises is essential, not just to save lives, but to strengthen lives going forward. Lives like those of Josephine Matibula here with her young grandson. And finally, going back to something Linda spoke to at the very beginning, Canada's budget 2021, a very good news piece of that budget was money that was pledged over the next 2 years, so in the very short term, for climate resilient agriculture. 200 million in new funding to support farmers to undertake all kinds of methods like cover cropping and rotational grazing and soil regeneration that will help to build up the essential infrastructure of farming, the soil, the water. 60 million to protect existing wetlands and trees on farms, and money to power the farms with clean energy. And this particular budget pronouncement wasn't the spontaneous, brilliant idea of the Canadian government, but rather was the work of farmers across the country, including Arzina Hamir from our own Comox Valley here on Vancouver Island, who is a member of Farmers for Climate Solutions and the National Farmers Union, and who argued vociferously with her organizations. They argued vociferously for support for farmers to be part of the climate solution. And as she said, farmers can't do this alone. We can do it with this support from government. That story holds, that line holds for farmers in the Global South who can't make these changes alone, who can't make the transformation to regenerative agriculture alone, but can do it with support. And finally, I would urge GRAN to make this argument to the Canadian government among your many important arguments that you take forward, that our international assistance policy needs to be informed by this same kind of thinking that we're applying here at home. It needs to be informed by a concern for community sustainability and social justice at community level for farmers and food producers and food systems. And I would encourage you to take that message to the Canadian government, and I'll end it there, and I'm very happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. That was really interesting. And I do have a few questions to put to you.
That's great.
One is a fairly practical question to start with. And that is, I think it's in Victoria, Lisby, saying they're looking at doing a sack gardens project with a local school. And do you have any stories about increasing the use of sack gardens to improve food security?
I know about Lisby's sack garden project that they've already been taking to the local schools, and it's really exciting. I have not seen sack gardens in use in Nuamitwa. I am quite sure, I'm certain that sack gardens are in use in Hillbrow in Johannesburg. There's a lot of farming, urban farming starting in Johannesburg. Well, it's been underway for some years by some farmers, but it's growing on rooftops of both derelict buildings and apartment buildings. And when I was last there in 2019, end of 2019, I saw vertical gardens of various kinds on a rooftop just across from Constitution Hill. So that was really exciting to see. And I can't say for sure that sack gardens were among the vertical methods, but they're in the same vein of space-saving innovation for growing food, in one's backyard or on one's rooftop.
Okay, thanks very much. Question about you ended off encouraging us to put forward the ideas of farming for climate solutions as part of the FIAP and international assistance. In any discussions you've had or any consultations you've done, do you see a receptivity in the international climate finance file, if you will, to incorporating these kind of local solutions? We're waiting for hopefully a big pledge. Do you see them picking up on empowerment for women, local solutions, those sorts of things?
I'm going to choose my words carefully.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not involved in the climate finance field,
Yeah,
so I'm not involved in consultations around climate finance. But a danger in my mind is that some of the thinkers who are very convinced by large-scale technological innovation as the way forward may predominate in those discussions. So for instance, there is a whole Green Revolution for Africa movement that you may well have heard about, which, is of the view that the Green Revolution, as it played out in places like South Asia and Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 70s, was a good thing and should be reiterated in a 21st century, sensitive to some of the problems that emerged earlier, should be reiterated in a 21st century version in Africa. And there's a great deal of criticism and concern from all kinds of social justice organizations about what that would mean. And that it might mean very similar things to what it meant in much of South Asia, which was pushing aside small-scale farmers or ramping them up to become commercial farmers, very dependent on chemical inputs, the likes of which we really cannot continue to rely on in the 21st century in light of the sort of catastrophic impacts of agriculture on the climate up to now. So agriculture produces between 25 and some say 40% of global greenhouse gases. We really have to back away from methods of agriculture that perpetuate that climate burden. And I worry that the Gates Foundation and other big agencies that are very keen on the technological fixes and modified green revolution fixes may predominate in those discussions. So that's a concern for me.
Thanks. That's a really good point, and we've certainly heard some things about the tension between those two areas for sure.
Yes, the tension is exactly the thing. There's a really big tension between regenerative agriculture movement and green revolution informed movement. And I just don't see how any kind of reiteration of the prior green revolution is the way forward in the 21st century, given the climate crisis.
Thank you. Specific question now on, do you know of any Stephen Lewis Foundation projects that are adopting these methods that you've been telling us about? Are you aware of any projects the foundation is funding?
I'm sure the Stephen Lewis Foundation is funding grassroots farming projects in Southern and Eastern Africa, but I'm not aware of them specifically. But I guess there are likely people in the room who could answer that question better than me.
There may well be. A couple of people have asked, and I think we will be able to make your slides available if that's all right.
Sure.
People wanted to go back and look at them again. Mm-hmm. And this has kind of been the theme of your presentation, but what is your vision of local agriculture in meeting future needs of the growing population in South Africa? Was that summarized on your last slides, or do you want to reiterate anything?
Yeah, I think we may need a kind of mixed portfolio, to use a really ugly metaphor, but for cereal crops, for instance, there's evidence that conventional methods, and why do we call them conventional methods? Because they've only been conventional for 50 or 60 years, but we call them conventional. The conventional methods are in fact the methods of the mothers and grandmothers, right? That Pepu refers to. Nevertheless, we talk about conventional agriculture, meaning that of the post-war era. There is some evidence that for cereal crops, conventional methods may be more productive and efficient. But for legumes and leafy greens and all kinds of other crops, agroecological methods, organic methods, regenerative methods, there's evidence to show that they're at least as productive. And I go back to that point about how most of the R&D money over the years has been spent on the conventional methods, on the post-war sort of, industrial agricultural methods. That's where the research and development money in agriculture has gone until very recently. In 2015, a group of scholars did a big meta-analysis, scholars based at Berkeley did a big meta-analysis of studies of conventional versus what they were calling organic methods, and found that the yield gap between conventional and organic methods was between 12 and 18%. But these scientists argued that were there anywhere near the amount of research into higher yield varieties of non-chemically mediated seed and crops, were there anywhere near the amount of research into how to improve those yields and how to improve, how to intensify farming with those crops that is invested in conventional crops, that yield gap would be closed. So that's a bit of a long sentence. I hope you could follow your way through it. But their argument was that if only we researched agroecological methods in anything like the intensity, that we research conventional methods, we would surely have extremely productive and sustainable methods sort of ready to hand. And so there has been more and more research in recent years. But so I think there are likely some fields, literally fields, in which the conventional methods will be more productive going forward, hopefully with reduction as much as possible in the chemical inputs that then flow into rivers and so on, and into the air. But there are many, many fields in which agroecological and regenerative methods, and that those are sort of overlapping categories, will prove out and have done in places like Malawi and Southeast Asia. And increasingly in the coming years, we'll have evidence to prove those methods. And we're increasingly getting that evidence now.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I think that's all the time we have for questions. I know there are more questions. We may be sending you a few emails with questions, but I'm going to hand it back.
I was going to say people are
Janet.
welcome to email me if they would like.
Okay, great.
Sure.
We'll make sure everybody is able to connect. I'll hand it back to Janet, our host and Zoom mistress.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. This has just been extraordinary, Elizabeth. I think what certainly struck me, and I'm sure many others in the room, is just for me to just see that impact in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, which of course is our focus in GRAN, has just been so powerful that I think it really does encourage us to really want to think about how we can gear some of our advocacy. And you've given us such some good examples of how we can kind of look at this in terms of our advocacy with the Canadian government and the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And of course, we've always been focused on the Sustainable Development Goals. So you have really tied the bow around it for us. So thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone that joined us today. It shows you how interested people are across the GRAN community in this issue of food sovereignty and food security and that relationship to the climate crisis. So again, thank you so much. And thank you for offering to take questions by email. I'm wondering, I think that Linda will be able to provide us with an email address for you. And if your slides are available, anyone that watches this video again will see them. But if you wanted to make them available separately, we can tell you that how we would use them perhaps on our GRAN website. So again,
sure, I'm happy to save them in a compressed file and I'll send them to Linda and Joanne.
Excellent.
But I wanted to say too that I really was honored to have the chance to speak to GRAN members. I think so highly of your work, and I suspect I know I was preaching to the choir, which is always a good position to be in. But I think that I was probably speaking about some things about which there are many experts in the room as well. So it was slightly daunting to speak to a GRAN audience, but also very inspiring for me to do so. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. If you'd like to, everyone can put their cameras back on.
Cameras on and
have
give
a
a
wave
wave.
goodbye. We will try and get this information, this recording available as soon as possible. It'll take a little bit of time, but we will get it up there on our website for everyone to view. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.